Nothing is perfect. There isn't a video game in the world that does everything optimally, and if there was, it would probably be extremely simple in order to eliminate as many factors as possible that could lead to an imperfect experience. And yet, there are still some experiences with games that transcend their imperfections to feel like much more than the sum of their parts. At a certain point, it doesn't really matter if a game has problems, big or small, because the whole is so charming that the issues fade away. At that point, they can feel perfect. Dusk is one of these games for me, even if it might sound strange to call it charming. My original plan was to do a review of Dusk, but the more I played, the more I realized it didn't need a review. Dusk is great. Go play it. Play it now. It's one of the best first-person shooters of this console generation, maybe of all time, and while it's been a while since I played Doom 2016, the two are very comparable in quality, I'd say. I have very few problems with Dusk. I wish you could remap gamepad controls without dipping into the INI file for one, since I'm not a fan of where the walk button is placed by default. Particularly because the walk button is integral to the climbing mechanic, it would become infinitely more usable on a gamepad if it was mapped to something other than L3 by default. I wish the game had an internal brightness setting that wasn't within the color palette option, because there were a few spots that were a bit too dark. I also wish the PC version had a weapon wheel, like the Switch port seems to be getting, but all of these problems are minor inconveniences at absolute worst. While the cowgirl enemies are manageable most of the time due to the way their AI works, they can sometimes be used in areas that don't suit them particularly well. Spawning 4 or 5 of them in an arena with no cover and at least a dozen other enemies feels like it relies a bit too much on luck. And the cart dog enemies can hit you in narrow spaces even if they aren't facing you when they charge. The point is, there are a small handful of issues like this strewn throughout, but none of it really mattered to me in the end. Every time I expected the game to run out of ideas, or push a bit too far like some of its predecessors do, it would maintain balance, focus, atmosphere, and an emphasis on a fresh experience. Every weapon has loads of mechanical value, with many of them offering a high skill ceiling. Every enemy provides a unique but simple challenge that complements other enemies well, making for a massive amount of mob configurations that play off of the environmental design as well. Every level is at least engaging in terms of raw level design, if not also incredibly interesting from a setting and aesthetic perspective. The game also has loads of options for making the experience feel more authentic to the time period of games it's trying to pay homage to. You can make Dusk look like it's running on a PC from the mid-90s, like a modern source port, like it's on a Game Boy, or whatever you want, thanks to things like the visual palette options. The music rivals the best of modern Doom, both in terms of its emphasis on metal and atmosphere. It even has a greater focus on horror elements that lends fantastically to the setting, and sounds straight out of Silent Hill or Resident Evil at points. It's no wonder Andrew Holsholt was picked to replace Mick Gordon on Doom Eternal's DLC soundtrack, because the only other comparable composer and musician I think could replace him is Misha Mansour. Despite only being on PC right now, and the little issue I mentioned before, Dusk even has fantastic controller support. Sure, I'd have liked true analog support for movement, because your character's incredibly fast, and as I said, being able to rebind buttons in-game would have been a massive help, but the game still feels fantastic on a controller, and the design works well with it. Right stick control just feels great, and there are several options for aim assist in Dusk, and they allow for massively different experiences for all sorts of skill levels. There's also an accessibility difficulty on top of that if necessary. I chose the console-like aim assist, since I assumed it was designed specifically for gamepad users, and interestingly, it actually kinda makes the game feel like old-school Doom. You still have to aim vertically, unlike Doom, but you can be quite a ways off in your aim and still hit your target. This allows the game to feel much more fast-paced and action-oriented, so that you don't get bogged down with precision aiming. Movement becomes a focus, which is generally when games like this are at their best. As a title trying to channel the greats of the past, Dusk works well for one very important reason, which a lot of classic game homages miss. Many games that are trying to capture a bygone age tend to create the very core of a certain experience, and then stop there. If you've ever played a Mega Man clone that is missing things like Mega Man's level select, or Robot Master weapons, or persistent secrets, or the slide, and then doesn't replace them with anything else, you know what I'm talking about. It looks like a Mega Man style game, it sounds like one, it plays like one to some extent, but it's missing all of the stuff that gave Mega Man a unique identity and made it replayable. Mega Man wasn't interesting in the 80s and 90s because he shot lemons. It's like they've written the core of a great song, but it's being performed by robots with terrible MIDI instruments that can't give it flavor. Other retro revival games do try much harder, but their focus is often on copying almost everything about the classics. So you end up with something that's basically a Mario game in every way except for the name and aesthetic. That can be fine on its own, but it still feels like it's just a shadow of what it's trying to mimic. Shovel Knight wouldn't stand out if it was literally just DuckTales. Still others try so hard to distance themselves from the original that it's like a death metal cover of a Lady Gaga song. At some point, it's unrecognizable, and many of the changes or modernizations prevent it from capturing any of that original experience. Dusk excels because it hits the perfect balance between the latter two categories. Dusk feels like a 90s shooter in most ways. If you stripped out all of the modern settings and you passed the controller to someone who was familiar with games but didn't know every single 90s shooter, I think most people would be fooled into thinking Dusk was released somewhere around the turn of the millennium. And yet, it doesn't spend all of its time trying to be Doom or Quake, Blood, Hexen, Heritic, Marathon, or Duke. Dusk feels like a game that would stand alongside them on its own, rather than like a game trying to cash in on a trend by copying one of them. It has original concepts, ideas, and designs, and it also offers modern quality of life features that weren't really implemented in games of that era. But it never strays so far that you start to see heavy influences from later eras of first-person shooters betray the homage it's trying to create. In fact, it honestly kind of feels like a disservice to call what Dusk does an homage, because while it is exactly that in a sense, it feels much more pure than that. It reminds me of games like Pier Solar, which had constraints placed on it by the fact that it's a Genesis revival game that was developed to also run on real Genesis hardware. These constraints force the game into a sort of time warp, where it really can't step too far away from what was actually possible for Genesis developers in the 90s. That same sort of feeling of restraint is found in Dusk 2. It feels like a game where the development team was forced into the headspace of a 90s PC shooter dev. It feels genuine to that era, but never to a fault. It's really interesting for me because part of me says that if you don't like that style of shooter, you won't like Dusk. But another part of me can feel how much smoother the difficulty balance is in subtle ways, how much more delicate the enemy AI balance is, and the ammo/armor/health balance is. I can feel how much more focused the level design can be at times, and how much less bloat the levels can have. There's very, very little wasted space in Dusk, which is not something you can say for many of the games it calls back to. So I suppose the best compromise is this. If you don't like 90s PC shooters because you can't get past the sometimes clunky, sometimes bloated, sometimes poorly balanced or unfocused design that's just kind of the sign of the era it was made in, you will probably find something to love in Dusk. And if you enjoy 90s PC shooters, well, you've probably already played Dusk. But if by some chance you haven't, then it should be at the top of your priorities list. Dusk isn't a perfect game. It isn't even a perfect revival of the genre it reveres so much, but the sum of its parts greatly transcends any issues it might have, to create something that can stand at the top of that group of games with the best of them. But what do you guys think? Have any of you played Dusk? How did you like it? How does it compare to your favorite shooter in this style? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.